This lecture will introduce you to the prophecy of Zechariah. We're moving into the area of apocalyptic visions. The theme of Zechariah involves rebuilding the temple, known as the Second Temple, and introducing some elements of the Messianic age. If I were to summarize the prophecy of Zechariah, I would say something like this. Out of his deep concern for Israel, here's what God will do. First off, he will send her a rejected Messiah. He will extend his protection over Israel. He promises to dwell with Israel once again. And finally, he will draw other nations to Israel, giving her a position of prominence. If you've read through the book of Zechariah recently, you would have noticed several famous lines. Let me lift out a few that you might recognize. Whoever touches you, referring to the daughter of Zion, touches the apple of his eye. Is not this man a burning stick snatched from the fire? A more famous phrase to you perhaps, not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn. On that day a fountain will be opened to the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, to cleanse them from sin and impurity. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. There may be other verses that would impress you, but these are a few that stood out to me. It's very important to understand the context for Zechariah. What's going on historically? We'll review briefly what happened before Zechariah leading up to his ministry, what happened during his ministry, and then a few notes of biblical information that occurs afterwards. First, prior to the arrival of Zechariah, the southern kingdom of Israel, Judah, has been conquered by Babylon. This occurred in stages. First off, 605, there was an exile which we would recognize as the time when Daniel was forcibly taken to Babylon. A few years later, another exile, this time Ezekiel and others, are taken to Babylon. Finally, in 586, or according to some records 587, the city of Jerusalem itself is destroyed. Not terribly long after that, about a half century later, the empire which has destroyed Israel is itself destroyed. So now the Persians are in charge, no longer the Babylonians. Continuing with some pointers, some events that occurred before Zechariah. As the Persians come to power, led by King Cyrus, he issues a very pivotal edict, the Edict of Restoration, 538, early in his reign. This edict offers an opportunity not only for the Jews, but for other nations as well to return to their homelands. It was a part of a policy to create goodwill among those, in essence, the prison populations which they had inherited from their predecessors, the Babylonians. As a result, 1 year later, we find that the Jewish prince Zerubbabel returns to Israel, and accompanying him is the priest, the religious leader, Joshua. This is certainly distinct from Joshua of the conquest era, much, much later, just the same name. References to this can be found in Ezra. This figure, the prince Zerubbabel, was in the monarchy lineage. Here you can see the lineup. Jehoiakim, exiled in 597. His son Shealtiel was father of Zerubbabel, who made his way back in 537, accompanied by Joshua the high priest. Now let's move to the era of Zechariah proper, not the events leading up to it, but during the period of Zechariah's prophecy and ministry. To get a picture, the book of Ezra will be very, very helpful, and I'd like to read segments of this. If you wish to fast forward to it, through this period of the video. Feel free to do so. The portions of Ezra that you want to be reading on the side, however, are the ones that you see displayed on the screen right now. Ezra 3:1 through 4:5, and then picking up again 4:24 through 6:22. So sit back and here's the story of Zechariah's era as told in Ezra's book. When the 7th month came, the Israelites were in the towns. The people gathered together in Jerusalem. Then Jeshua, son of Jozadak, with his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, with his kin, set out to build the altar of the God of Israel, to offer burnt offerings on it, as prescribed in the law of Moses, the man of God. So they set up the altar on its foundation. That's a pivotal event. It happened evidently not long after they had arrived, and it's Zerubbabel, then governor, who is allowed by Cyrus of Persia to get things rolling again. They set up the altar on its foundation because they were in dread of the neighboring peoples. They offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord morning and evening, kept the festival of booths as described, and offered daily burnt offerings, and so on. Notice in verse 6, from the first day of the 7th month they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, but the foundation of the temple of the Lord was not yet laid. The temple proper, the structure was not yet, the reconstruction was not built, simply the altar, and that would have been an outdoor altar. That would not have required the temple building to be in place. Verse 7, so they gave money to the masons and the carpenters, food and drink and oil to the Sidonians and Tyrians to bring cedar trees from Lebanon to the sea, to Joppa, according to the grant they had received from King Cyrus of Persia. In the 2nd year after their arrival at the house of God at Jerusalem, in the 2nd month, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, son of Jozadak, made a beginning together with the rest of the people, priests and Levites, and all who had come to Jerusalem from the captivity. And they appointed Levites, 20 years old and upward, to have oversight of the work on the house of the Lord. So they're trying then to make forward motion for construction of the temple. The foundation was laid, we see down here in verse 11, and it caused great rejoicing. Verse 13 is an interesting one. 12 and 13. Many of the priests and Levites and heads of the people, the old people, heads of families and old people who had seen the first house, that is the first temple, the Solomonic temple, on its foundations, wept with a loud voice when they saw this house, though many shouted aloud for joy, so that people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping. For the people shouted so loudly that the sound was heard far away. So there are two groups of people. The younger generation are delighted to see the beginning of the building of the temple. The older generation remembers the splendor of the Solomonic temple, and they weep, for it brings back memories of what used to be, but was no longer. Not long after they began building the temple, however, there are problems in the form of people around them who want them to stop. So chapter 4 of Ezra. When the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the families and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do. We have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of King Esarhaddon of Assyria, who brought us here." Interesting statement. These are residents in the area who were already on the scene before Zerubbabel and his group comes back from Babylon. These people have already been living in the area. How long have they been living there? They have been living there since the days of King Esarhaddon of Assyria. These were transplants who were brought into Israel when the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians. These are not native Israelites. These are people who were forcibly relocated. They did not want to come. They had been moved there by the previous overrunning empire, the Assyrians. And now they see new people coming into the community, namely Zerubbabel and the Jews coming back from Babylon. It makes them uncomfortable. Zerubbabel responds to them, And we see in verse 3, you shall have no part with us in building a house to our God. We alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as the King Cyrus of Persia has commanded us. Then the people of the land, the predecessors, discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build. And they bribed officials to frustrate their plan throughout the reign of King Cyrus of Persia and until the reign of King Darius of Persia. Significant statement. As a result of the machinations, the efforts, literally the bribes of these predecessors in the land, they are able to interfere with the temple building progress. And we're told by Ezra exactly how long that lasted. King Cyrus of Persia, and he was the king who said, go ahead, go back to Israel and start building the temple, all the way through the reign of King Darius of Persia. Just a little bit later in this lecture, we'll show you how long a span of time that was. We're going to skip this portion that's gray because it describes, through Ezra's writing, another interference with temple building, but it's not an interference that pertains right to this era. It's a later one in Ezra's ministry proper. Now, resuming the Zechariah and Zerubbabel era, chapter 4, verse 24 of Ezra, we read, at that time the work on the house of God in Jerusalem was stopped and was discontinued until the, here's the resumption point, second year of the reign of King Darius of Persia. And here's what happens right along that period. Chapter 5 of Ezra. Now the prophets, Haggai, and here's our target prophet, Zechariah son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. Good position to be in, God being over you. Then Zerubbabel son of Shealtiel and Jeshua son of Josedek set out to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem. And with them were the prophets of God helping them. Beautiful statement, isn't it? So through the urging ministry of these prophets, the people got busy and resumed building, and the prophets are right alongside helping them. There is further disturbance, resistance by people of the land. It's some years later, but this time the figure is named Tattenai, who is governor of the prince beyond the river, this region, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates came to them and spoke to them thus, who gave you a decree to build this house and to finish the structure? And they also asked them this, what are the names of the men who are building the building? But the eye of their God was upon the elders of the Jews, and they did not stop them until a report reached Darius. And then an answer was returned by letter in reply to it. A fascinating event in ancient history. So once again, there's an effort to disrupt the building. It entails a letter being written by a governor in the area of Judea, being sent back to the then empire ruler, Darius of the Persians. And then a letter comes back from Darius. Beginning in verse 6 here of chapter 5, we have a copy of the letter that Tattenai, governor of that province, sends. And he says, middle of verse 7, to Darius the king, all peace. May it be known to the king that we went to the province of Judah, to the house of the great God. It is being built of hewn stone, and timber is laid in the walls. This work is being done diligently and prosperous in their hands. And then he goes on to say, who said you could do this? And their reply, verse 11, we are the servants, that is the reply of the Jews, of Zerubbabel and company, we are the servants of the God of heaven and earth. We are rebuilding the house that was built many years ago, which a great king of Israel built and finished, referring back to Solomon. But because our ancestors angered the God of heaven, he gave them into the hand of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this house and carried away the people to Babylonia. Verse 13, however, King Cyrus of Babylon, in the first year of his reign, made a decree that the house of God should be rebuilt. Interesting statement. He's referred to as King Cyrus of Babylon. We would recognize him as King Cyrus of Persia. But certainly he conquered the Babylonian Empire. Perhaps that's why he's being listed as chief over Babylon. Moreover, the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken, and so on, he describes even these have been returned. And now in chapter 6 of Ezra, we find Darius, having received this protest, makes a decree, and it begins by searching the archives where the documents were stored, and they were stored in Babylon. Now, it turns out they're actually stored in Ecbatana, we're told, the capital in the province of Media, and a scroll was found in which was written the following: a record. In the first year of his reign, King Cyrus issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem, let the house be rebuilt. So this authorizes that these people in Judea are legitimate in rebuilding the temple according to this earlier edict from Persian King Cyrus. Darius goes on in verse 6, saying, now you, Tatanai, governor of the prince beyond the river, Shethar-Bozenai, and you, their associates, and so on. Verse 7, let the work on this house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site, and makes further provisions for that. Darius concludes in verse 12, I, Darius, make a decree, let it be done with all diligence. And he prohibits any interference. And then verse 13 of Ezra 6, according to the word sent by King Darius, Tatanai, the governor of the province beyond the river, Shethar-Bozenai, and all their associates did with all diligence what King Darius had ordered. So the elders of the Jews built and prospered through the prophesying of the prophet Haggai and Zechariah, son of Iddo. They finished their building by the command of God of Israel and by the decree of Cyrus, Darius, and King Artaxerxes of Persia. And there Ezra is drawing in some of his own contemporary period with Artaxerxes, subsequent to Zechariah. And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. And then the story goes on to explain what great joy accompanied that conclusion. A beautiful case of a prophecy which was met by the eager response of the people despite opposition and a successful conclusion. As you're familiar with the story of the other prophets, by now you realize that's not always what happened. Too often the ministry of the prophets fell on deaf ears and resulted in God having to punish the people. But this time the prophecy went out, the urging of the prophet, both Zechariah and Haggai, and as a result the temple was rebuilt. A major part of Zechariah's ministry, but by no means the entirety of his prophecy. He had much else to say, and we'll get to that shortly. And so Zechariah says the building of temple took place with large stones. This is the western wall, formerly known as the Wailing Wall, part of the support structure for the plaza on which the temple was built in Herod's time. Admittedly, some of this retaining wall dates to a later period, but notice the capability of these ancient engineers to build with large stone. Let's get a point of reference to see how large this stone is. That's the same stone. It is huge, just absolutely huge. You can see that in the western wall if you were to go there today. Around the corner to the right, here's another stone, building with large stones. They were definitely capable of doing that in the ancient world. Egyptians had no corner on large stones, although the pyramids are certainly evidence of some phenomenal engineering. Returning to Zechariah, then the temple altar was built initially. Here is a model showing the external altar there in the foreground before the pillared building, one model of the temple. And the time frame of that, the 7th month, would refer to the September-October time frame, based on the first month being March-April, when Passover takes place. And according to Ezra, that was accompanied, that took place in the time frame of the Festival of Tabernacles. That was celebrated soon after with an immense amount of sacrifices, an 8-day period, great celebration. And then, as we noticed earlier, the foundation of Solomon's temple is laid. This is a model that helps us portray what the temple layout may have looked like. And that's the period when the younger generation marked the laying of the foundation with joy, and the older generation who had seen the previous temple, the actual Temple of Solomon, marked it with sorrow. We've referred to the opposition by local residents, as described by Zechariah, and now the recap of the opposition, which lasted from Cyrus' era all the way to the second year of the reign of Darius. And we've seen, according to Ezra, how these opponents descended from people settled in Israel by the Assyrians, namely their leader Esarhaddon. So the interference to the building of the temple proper lasted from during the reign of Cyrus through a ruler of Persia that's not named in the Ezra material, but one we know from extra-biblical histories, Cambyses, down to the start of Darius I, also of Persia. We do not want to confuse this with Darius that's named in the Daniel material. This is a different Darius. So the Darius of Zechariah's era, as we read a little bit ago, makes search for Cyrus' edict, recorded there in Ezra chapter 6. And it was found in Ecbatana. Here is a bit of a map that shows you over on the center right, Ecbatana. It would be the territory where that discovery was made. And next is a piece of archaeological artifact, which is one of the most famous in terms of study of the Hebrew Bible. There has actually been recovered Cyrus' Edict of Restoration. And this is what it looks like. You can find this in the British Museum in London. It's a marvelous, marvelous piece. If you look closely, you're looking at cuneiform using a wedge-shaped stylus to press into soft clay. This, known as Cyrus Cylinder, is the actual artifact which records the authorization by Cyrus of Persia for these non-indigenous populations. You might call them, well, they were transplants, conquered peoples, exiles who had been forcibly brought by the predecessor empire, the Babylonians. This is the edict saying you can go back now. As we've seen according to the Zechariah account, or excuse me, the Ezra account, then the temple rebuilding starts up again. And Haggai, together with Zechariah, were instrumental in making that happen. That would be equivalent of September 21. It's kind of fascinating how we're able to correlate calendars. September 21 of 520 BC. Haggai 1:15 also refers to that. And in 516, on March 10, it was actually completed. It must have been particularly meaningful to the residents in Jerusalem to be able to celebrate Passover once again. You see, Passover cannot properly be celebrated unless the temple is in place. Our Jewish friends that celebrate Passover today are doing it in their homes in a slightly modified fashion. It would be done differently if there was a temple in place. And this time, the temple was rebuilt, and so Passover could be celebrated as it's meant to be celebrated. Now, the era following Zechariah, it will be after Zechariah's life and ministry that Ezra, from whose book we were recently reading, will make his way to Jerusalem, 458 BC, almost 60 years after the temple was completed under the ministry of Zechariah together with Haggai. Nehemiah, who authored a book by his name, we know that from the Hebrew Bible, Nehemiah will rebuild Jerusalem's city wall, distinct from rebuilding the temple. He was interested in helping restore security to the city as a whole, and that will be in the time frame of 445 to 33 during the reign of Artaxerxes. let's leave this review of the history, the historical context, and turn now to Zechariah as an individual and ask ourselves, what kind of an individual was he? What can we know about him? Some of this is speculative, but we'll think about it together all the same. Returned to Israel with his parents at a young age. This is conjectured. It's thought that the early prophecies, the chapters 1 through 8, the front end of the book, roughly the first half, may correspond to a younger era in his life. And the remainder, 9 to 14, may correspond to a later era in his life. We've already commented that Haggai was a teammate, and we've seen portions in Ezra that name them side by side, in contrast to some other prophets where we can put together the puzzle and realize, for example, that Jeremiah is operating in the same time frame as a contemporary of Ezekiel, but their books don't talk about each other. In places like Ezra, both Haggai and Zechariah are named together. Let's now look at an overview, an outline of the book of Zechariah. 8 visions comprise the first 6 chapters. And it's interesting to note that in chapter 1, verse 1, and also verse 7, and then again in chapter 7, verse 1, we have in essence some date stamps, some formula that indicate when these visions were given. So we can tell that these took place in the time frame of 520 to 518 BC. After a few introductory comments, we encounter the vision of a man among the myrtle trees. Let's see what's going on in this case. In verse 11, there's mention that the world is at rest. 14, the Lord is jealous for Jerusalem, but angry with those who feel secure. God will again comfort Zion and choose Jerusalem. Those are some of the sentiments that come through the first vision. The second vision, 4 horns and 4 craftsmen. Chapter 1, verse 18 and following. These horns have the effect, these are not musical horns, but horns of power, like horns on an animal. These have the effect of scattering Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. And there are some craftsmen whose effect is to terrify and throw down the horns of the nations. A third vision occurs beginning in chapter 1. There appears a man with a measuring line. And in this vision we learn that Jerusalem will be a city without walls. God says, I will at that time live among you. Many nations will be joined with the Lord in that day and will become God's people. The fourth vision begins in chapter 3, verse 1, and it's addressed to the high priest. Take off his filthy clothes, comes the instruction. See, I have taken away your sin. There's a promise in this vision of a coming leader and purification. I will bring my servant the branch. I will remove the sin of this land in a single day. And there's a promise of peace. You will invite your neighbor to sit under a vine and under the fig tree, which is a classic expression of enjoying the comforts and the provisions in a land that's no longer under threat. The fifth vision involves a golden lampstand, and this occurs in chapter 4. This is the place where a verse that may be familiar to many appears. Not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. And what is it that will take place? Not by human effort or ingenuity, but by God's Spirit. It is, in fact, the rebuilding of the temple. And the golden lampstand is reminiscent of the menorah, although it's on a grander scale, the menorah of the temple. The sixth vision portrays a flying scroll beginning in chapter 5, verse 1. This is a scroll of very large proportions and has a message of a curse directed against a thief, and a curse against someone who swears with an intent to deceive, a perjurer. The seventh vision involves a woman who is in a basket. Begins in chapter 5, verse 5. And this woman is emblematic or symbolic of the iniquity of the people. The eighth vision involves 4 chariots. Begins in chapter 6, verse 1. And these chariots with various horses of various colors go through different territories of the land. In chapter 7, we encounter a call for justice and also a call for mercy. At this point, we're leaving the visions and moving into more standard oracles. Administer true justice. Show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the alien or the poor. In your hearts, do not think evil of each other. Reads chapter 7 from verses 8 through 10. The oracle in chapter 8 offers a promise of blessing for Jerusalem. God says in verse 2, I am very jealous for Zion. In verse 3, he says, I will return to Zion. I will dwell in Jerusalem. Language reminiscent of a theme from Exodus, a theme from Ezekiel. In verse 9, let your hands be strong so the temple may be built. Perhaps this oracle was given at a time when the temple had not yet been finished. And so it was part of the motivation to urge the people to complete building the temple. I will save you, and you will be a blessing. Do not be afraid. From verse 13. As I determined to bring disaster, so now I have determined to do good again to Jerusalem. Speak the truth to each other. Render true and sound judgment in your courts. Do not plot evil against your neighbor, and do not love to swear falsely. And at this time, nations, he writes, will take firm hold of one Jew by the hem of his robe and say, let's go with you, because we have heard that God is with you. So a variety of themes roll together in the oracle of chapter 8. Chapters 9 to 14 encompass a variety of oracles of judgment as well as deliverance. Here are a few highlights that come from them. Chapter 9, Gaza will lose her king. So this is directed to a nation outside of Israel. But I will defend my house. Also chapter 9, see, your king comes to you on a donkey. The Lord their God will save them on that day as the flock of his people, like jewels in a crown. That's chapter 9, verse 16. Chapter 10, verse 10. I will bring them back from Egypt, from Assyria. Messages then of deliverance. Chapter 11, verse 16. I am going to raise up a shepherd over the land who will not care for the lost, or seek for the young, or heal the injured, or feed the healthy, but will eat the meat of the choice sheep, tearing off their hooves. This is a very stark oracle about the establishment for a period of time of a leader who will treat the people under his care very roughly. But this will not be the final or ultimate end. Chapter 12, verses 1 through 9, talk about protection for Jerusalem during a time of siege. When all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. All who try to move it, that is, oppose Israel, oppose Jerusalem, will injure themselves. That's chapter 12, verse 3. Again, from chapter 12, a spirit of supplication poured out on Jerusalem. Chapter 12, verse 10, I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn. 13:1 reads, on that day a fountain will be opened up for the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and impurity. And from chapter 14, a picture of God establishing his kingdom on earth. Verse 4 of 14, on that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. It will be a unique day without daytime or nighttime. 14:6. And in 14:9, the Lord will be king over the whole earth. And from verse 17 of chapter 14, if any peoples of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord Almighty, they will have no rain. So a curse against those who do not side with Israel, who do not worship God at his established capital or throne there in Jerusalem. So chapters 9 to 14, a variety of oracles, some of judgment and some of deliverance. In terms of literary context, scholars have read Zechariah and raised the question, is this comprised of one unit, a book that's cohesive throughout, or was it at some time two books? Those who would view the work of Zechariah as comprised of two books would put the division somewhere about chapter 8, seeing that the earlier portion, 1 through 8, was primarily visions, as opposed to principally oracles, dominating chapters 9 to 14. As we observe this, certainly it's true that 1 through 8 is where most of the visions occur. We want to acknowledge that there are some oracles that appear in the earlier material. For example, chapter 1, verses 2 to 6, 12 to 17, chapter 2, 6 to 13, among others, are places where oracles appeared in principally the vision heavy section. Also, this point of view is offered favoring Zechariah, two sections of this book. It's pointed out that temple reconstruction is very important, we know, to the thrust, the message of Zechariah. Certainly an oracle, or rather a vision like chapter 4, the vision of the golden lamp, would be emblematic of God saying, I am going to make it possible for the seemingly impossible to take place, namely the rebuilding of the temple. That's in the front half. And yet it's pointed out that mention of temple reconstruction doesn't seem to be present in the second half. So some would say, if that's such a big theme, perhaps the second half was written by someone else at a later time. Scholars also point to the mention of Greece, the nation of Greece, in chapter 9, verse 13, and say, since Greece was a major empire later than the 6th century, the time frame of Zechariah and the rebuilding the temple, perhaps the portion of the book, 9 and following, perhaps that belongs to a later time frame. We'll revisit this question in just a bit. In response to this, it's worth observing that to this date, at least, there has been no manuscript of Zechariah recovered, which made it split in this fashion. All the manuscripts that we have know of Zechariah as being a unit. As to visions over against oracles, as commented just a little bit ago, it's worth observing that there are some oracles in the vision-heavy material, 1 through 8. So that's need to reconsider the theory that one style, vision, would trace to one author or an era, and a second style, oracles, would trace to a different author or a different era. How about Greece? Mention of Greece in 9:13, and the consequent suggestion that that portion of the book may date to the 4th century when Greece was a major force. It's worth observing that Greece, there's reference to the people prior to the 4th century. So perhaps it's being a little too narrow to suggest that mention of Greece means it's Greece as an empire of the 4th century. It may mean mention of a people group which was in existence even before the 4th century. Brevard Childs has pointed out that there are themes which run across the boundary of 8 and 9. That is, chapter 1 themes occurring in 1 through 8. Some of them recur in 9 to 14 as well. Here are some that he brings out. New Jerusalem protected by the Lord. The return of Edenic fertility to the land. The use of the covenant formula as a promise. Divine judgment on the nations. These occur in both 1 through 8 and also 9 to 14. Regathering of the exiles. Outpouring of the Spirit to start the new age. Purging the land of false swearers, those who perjure in God's name. A messianic figure who triumphs through humility. These appear on both sides of the suggested divide. So these are some elements of alternative information that are useful as we entertain the possibility of Zechariah being twofold or being unitary. Apocalyptic symbolism. Since Zechariah is heavy with apocalyptic symbolism, it's worth identifying what are some of the features that characterize apocalyptic prophecy. These are taken from Old Testament Survey in the chapter devoted to Zechariah. Just as a reminder, when we're talking about apocalyptic, this means revelatory. That is the meaning of that term. One aspect that is used to identify prophetic material as belonging to apocalyptic genre is a heavenly perspective, being able to look down either on earthly events or look around at celestial events, and the perspective of the speaker or the information is coming from a heavenly viewpoint. Chapter 1, verse 8 would be indicative of this. It would be helpful just to briefly take a look at that. Zechariah 1:8. And so Zechariah reports in the night, I saw a man riding on a red horse. He was standing among the myrtle trees in the glen, and behind him were red sorrel and white horses. And he says, what are these, my Lord? So this is not a typical view, particularly when it's mentioned in verse 10, they are those whom the Lord has sent to patrol the earth. So these are people operating, these are individuals, supernatural beings who are operating from a different realm, a celestial or a heavenly perspective. A second element which tips us off to an apocalyptic genre is the presence of an angelic mediator. That is, someone who's serving as, in the case of Zechariah, let's take a look at that again, sort of a tour guide, someone who's explaining what's going on. And so Zechariah in verse 9 says, what are these, my Lord? And there's a response of an angel who talks with him. A third is the presence of symbolic imagery. Symbolic imagery. Chapter 1, verse 18 and following. Then I looked up, and there before me were 4 horns. And Zechariah responds to this visual image and says, what are these? And it's explained, these are the horns that scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. The horns are symbolic. Excuse me. A fourth dimension, which indicates indicates apocalyptic genre, is periodization of history. This is especially prominent in Daniel, not so much so in Zechariah, but if you were to take a look at Daniel 2, 7, or 8, you would see visions which Daniel is given, which paint human history in large empire-sized brushstrokes. the empire of the Assyrians, the empire of the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and so on. So breaking history down into vast periods, this is part of the perspective which often is represented as expressed in apocalyptic material. Fifth is perspective regarding the solution. The people of God in particular are portrayed as going through times of trouble, but that's not all. Through the apocalyptic vision and prophecies and oracles, a solution is provided, but the solution does not happen within human history. It happens at the end of human history. It does not happen by God ordaining a particular ruler among his people to lead them to success, nor by God ordaining perhaps a ruler from outside to bring punishment, a human ruler from outside. Rather, the solution comes when God brings human history to a close and establishes his kingdom. So the solution comes in end time. Chapter 4, verse 14 would be an example of this. Let's turn our attention now to some of the principal themes of a theological sort, which we discover as we review the message of Zechariah. We find, first off, condemnation of self-serving religion. Condemnation of self-serving religion. Chapter 5, when we move to some of the oracles proper, we find the people are asking the question, should we go on observing a fast during months number 5 and months 7? Is this a practice that God is pleased with? Is something that is really important to him? And the response comes, are you fasting or feasting in those times for yourself, or are you doing it for me? By way of information, the fasting that was proclaimed for those times, the 5th month would have been a memorial period of sorrow, because that was the month of the year in which their beloved capital, Jerusalem, was destroyed. And the 7th month would correspond to the month when Gedaliah, who was appointed as the governor by the Babylonians when they took over Jerusalem and removed the last standing king, Zedekiah, then they put in his place Gedaliah, and Gedaliah was assassinated in the 7th month. So it's thought this perhaps was the reason for a fast in the 7th month. So the people were observing this fast, and they asked Zechariah, is this something we should continue doing? And God responds through Zechariah, let's examine once again, what's your motive for this? Is it perhaps self-serving religion? You're going through the motions, but you're not really reaching out to me. And if that's the case, then just forget it entirely. Chapter 7, verse 10 reads this way, this is what the Lord Almighty says, administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the alien or the poor. In your hearts do not think evil of each other. So, returning to a theme that we've seen in many of the other prophets, social justice, compassion, loving your neighbor, these are more important than self-serving religion. A second theme, theological theme within the book, promise of God's restoration. So in verses such as 8:3, 12:3, and 14:20, we find God saying, I will return to Zion and dwell in Jerusalem. This must have been so comforting and heartening to the people. Jerusalem will be called the city of truth. The mountain of the Lord Almighty will be called the holy mountain. I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. And holiness will basically be rampant through the kingdom, God's restoration. Gentiles, non-Israelite peoples will be included in God's care. And so we find in chapter 8:20 and other passages, many nations will come to Jerusalem. The inhabitants of one city will go to another and say, let's go at once to entreat the Lord, and that's specifically the God of Israel, and seek the Lord Almighty. I myself am going. Many peoples and powerful nations will come to Jerusalem to seek the Lord Almighty and to entreat Him. When we ask the question, how is God portrayed through this book? What are the attributes? Here is what can stand out to us. God will appear as the universally reigning king who will set up rule on earth. It's a principal picture of God. Eventually, He will show up on the scene and there will be no disputing. He will be the person, the individual in charge, and that reign will be set up on the earth. When we ask a little more broadly, what contribution does the book of Zechariah make to our sense of theology, our biblical theology, as opposed to systematic? Beyond the character of God, what contribution does this book make? Future restoration of the Jewish people, chapter 10, brings this out. There is messianic foreshadowing, and some of the passages here are remarkably precise as we understand them fulfilled through the Second Covenant in the New Testament. Let's take a look at a few of those. Your king will come to you, righteous, and he will be on a donkey, reminiscent of Jesus in the triumphal entry. And there is mention of someone being paid 30 pieces of silver. He's being thrown into the temple to the potter. Much overlap with what Judas did after he had betrayed Jesus. 30 pieces of silver. The payment then, on second thought, being rejected, and mention of a potter. They will look on the one whom they have pierced. This has been likened to the experience of Jesus on the cross and the view of people around him, his fellow countrymen, and certainly members of the Roman nation as well, looking on him. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered is mentioned in the New Testament as well. In fact, scholars have counted up how many of the references, how many times the New Testament refers to material from Zechariah, and it's a rather large figure, 71 times. Some of these are distinctly messianic, not all of them. The book of Revelation, John's revelation of Jesus, is particularly thick with usage of reference to Zechariah. As we conclude then, moving from the historical to the theological now, thinking about the application, how can this message apply, first of all, to the original people? Two elements stand out. First, quite clearly, the people should have been heartened and should have been fortified to return to the difficult business of rebuilding the temple. Now, on one level, we might think, well, that's a cultural piece, a beautiful piece of architectural with a rich sense of national identity. But if you'll recall how significant the temple was on a spiritual level right from the inception with the wilderness tabernacle, you'll realize there's more to it than just national identity. Here's, in a nutshell, here's how it goes. It was understood in the ancient world that even among peoples outside of Israel, if they had a god, that God should have some kind of a building to say, this is where he is and this is how we treat him with respect, how we recognize that he is among us. God used that same kind of imagery in developing the wilderness tabernacle. So he said in Exodus 25:8, build it so I can live among you. He authorized, he sealed his pleasure, indicated his pleasure with it, as at the end of Exodus, he invaded the temple with his gracious presence in such an intensity that even Moses, who spoke to God face to face, could not enter that building because God had infused it with his presence. Later, when Solomon will complete the building of the hard side, the permanent structure temple, that same experience took place. God moved in with his presence with such a powerful intensity that even the priests who were authorized to serve there could not enter, could not serve, because God was saying, I'm here, I'm moving in. In Ezekiel, when the people sin, in essence, putrefying the temple, making it a place uninhabitable by God, we find through those first 11 chapters of Ezekiel God distancing himself. He's exiting the temple, moving eastward, actually in the direction where the people are exiled, saying, I can no longer dwell in the temple. Happily, according to Ezekiel 11:16, I will be with you as a mobile sanctuary, a beautiful, gracious indication of him moving with the people. And then at the end of Ezekiel, moving back into the temple. Consequently, this entire image of the temple structure as being so important to indicate that the people are valuing God dwelling with them. This, then in Zechariah, takes on great importance. God is saying, I'm not satisfied that you simply built the altar. We need the building there as well. And that's a way of saying, the people saying to God, we are serious about making a place for you to dwell, and God being there with the people. The presence of God among the people of God, which is where God wants to be ever since the Sinai covenant. And so it was very important for the people to pick up their building tools once again, despite the opposition of people in the neighborhood who preceded them, Tanai and others of that sort. It was very important for them courageously to say, God, we're serious about wanting you to dwell among us. We're going to rebuild the temple. And consequently, there was great joy when it was completed, the Festival of Tabernacles. As part of that, part of the rebuilding, the altar rebuilding, and then the Festival of Passover following the temple rebuilding. A second application for the people would be for that to encourage them to look forward to the day when not simply would the temple be rebuilt, which they achieved in their own time frame, 516 BC, but a day when God's reign would be of just a phenomenally authoritative, a universal and persuasive sort. Messages of apocalyptic imagery and oracles are intended to encourage God's people during times when surrounding political or economic conditions would discourage them. God reaches in with a message of an apocalyptic sort to say, hang on, eventually I am coming and setting up my kingdom, and then things will be set right. As we take the message of Zechariah to heart for us, it's very important, as usual, to extract from this an application for the modern era that will be consistent. That way we know we're treating seriously the original message in its original context. And so, just as they were encouraged to build the temple, for us, we should ask the question of ourselves, do we prize and pursue the presence of God, or is the modern equivalent of rebuilding the temple something that we've been deterred from? What are the pressures that keep us from pursuing God's presence? And here, please understand, we are not referring to building a physical structure. We're referring to systems or habits or practices where we pursue from our heart the presence of God together with others of his people. Secondly, is the fact of God's eventual setting up of his reign, the fact that this will take place one day, is that serving to us as a source of courage in times when we may be dismayed? Think of what's going on around you. Think of what's going on around in the world today. What are those voices, what are those forces which would cause the people of God to be discouraged, cause them to give up hope? In each one of those, we should be taking a page out of Zechariah's oracles and realizing that although there would be times, there may be times of punishment, eventually God will set things right and he will look out for his people and set up his kingdom, a time when others will want to take hold, as it says, the Ham of the Jew, want to take hold of God's people and say, may I go with you to the place where God reigns, because I want to worship him too. I want to be in alignment with your God. Clearly he is in charge, and he is the one who can give the rains for our crops, who can give prosperity for us. It's a complex book. It's one worthy of deeper study, certainly a book that I do not in any way claim to fully understand, but nevertheless, from a review of the high points, I hope it's a book that you can derive some encouragement and feel a little more comfortable as you go back into select portions, understanding when it was written, the style through which it was written, and what are some of the principal theological messages and consequently applications which we can benefit from today.